Alright, hello. So today we'll be going over the carbon dioxide and nitrogen cycles. So I'm going to start with carbon dioxide because it's in the SL syllabus and I thought it might be more useful to go over it first to give context on how these cycles actually work. But pretty much in the carbon cycle, we know that carbon dioxide is of course bound in our atmosphere. It's actually one of the most present greenhouse gases in our environment, and in that pursuit we know that plants also assimilate carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and that brings up a lot of other chain reactions because we know that plants also play a role in a lot of plants are essentially the fundamental part of any ecosystem, and so we know plants are eaten, they die, and that brings rise to a whole lot of ways that carbon dioxide can actually propagate through an ecosystem. So, to kind of start here, I'm going to combine, I'm going to list off some reservoirs. And you know what reservoirs are actually places this carbon dioxide will be found. And these arrows that I'll draw represent fluxes or essentially direction of movement of the nutrient, in this case carbon dioxide, not really a nutrient, but I guess you can say a substance that's being passed on from one reservoir to another. So to get started, I'm going to put down atmosphere. Oops, let me change the thickness. Atmosphere and H2O. Now, you don't have to combine these two reservoirs because they are two distinctly different things, but they function quite the same. I think it's useful to remember. I think it's useful to remember that carbon dioxide is also present in water, and it can actually occur in two ways. First, it can occur as naturally dissolved carbon dioxide, which is typically found at deeper ocean layers because carbon dioxide can only exist in the aqueous phase at really high pressure, but it can also occur in the marine environment by, first of all, reacting with H2O to form carbonic acid. But because carbonic acid is not a very stable compound, it dissociates into H plus ions and bicarbonate ions, and these bicarbonate ions, along with dissolved carbon dioxide, is what serves as the main carbon dioxide source in marine ecosystems. But that's a bit of a spiel, not too important. So with carbon dioxide in air and water, one thing we know for sure that happens is that this is essentially taken up. This is essentially taken up by organic, essentially plants. I'm just going to say producers. And we know the process is photosynthesis. So I'm going to put photosynthesis right here. And photosynthesis is pretty self-explanatory. Water and carbon dioxide, and maybe some ATP, react to form glucose, and we know that glucose is a very fundamental carbon compound in all organisms. So the question is, what actually happens to these producers? Well, two things can happen. First of all, the producer can be fed on via herbivory by primary consumers, otherwise known as herbivores. So I'm going to say herbivory, and I'm going to say consumers. I'm not going to say tertiary, secondary, primary, whatever. I'm just going to call them all consumers because the same thing essentially happens to all of them. Now, another thing that can happen to producers is, well, they can just die. And when that happens, I'll actually label this death because I think die is a bit too direct. I'll label it death. And well, where does it go when it dies? Well, we know that, they just become dead. And I'll show you where I'm going with this in a bit, but for now we're just going to call it dead organic material. So now we have two new reservoirs. We have producer, we have consumer, and we have dead organic material. Now, we can actually just go back to the consumer and think about what happens to a consumer in an ecosystem. And again, two things can happen. The consumer can keep living and continue to respire. Now, respiration is a process where organisms essentially produce ATP in aerobic conditions by, again, taking maybe like necessary organic compounds and then converting it to ATP. And this actually is not a very efficient process, so a lot of energy is expelled as heat. But that's beside the point. A byproduct of ATP production is actually carbon dioxide. So by respiration, we're actually just going to end up releasing more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. So that's one other flux we have. So I'm going to call this respiration. And then for the other thing that can happen to the consumers, well, we know producers can die, and so can consumers. So I'm going to say death. And both the death of consumers and producers lead to the same reservoir. So now we have a couple of things going on here. We have the producers and the consumers with two possible fluxes, and then we have this overarching dead organic material bin, reservoir, whatever you'd like to call it. So what happens to this dead organic material? Well, we know that saprotrophs essentially feed on this dead organic material, and this actually just takes the carbon dioxide found in the organic material and then transfers it to the saprotroph. So here's another flux we can draw. We can say that from dead organic material, by external digestion, which is the mode of nutrition of the saprotroph, external digestion, we have a new reservoir, which is just the saprotroph. So now we have a new reservoir, which is a saprotroph. So we now question what happens to the saprotroph. Well, the saprotroph, just like every other organism, also goes through respiration. So we can also draw this flux and call it respiration. Now, we have this starting to snowball kind of chain, but we're not done there. I'm actually going to resize this so I can add some more things. We're not really done with dead organic material, because let's think about a scenario where you have a waterlogged environment. Well, in these waterlogged environments, we have very anoxic or anaerobic conditions. We know that saprotrophs essentially need oxygen to adequately break down and process dead organic material. So the question is, what happens to the dead organic material found in these anoxic environments? Well, they're simply not broken down. They eventually turn into peat, and this peat, right, this undecayed dead organic material, but with time, in either marine or terrestrial environments, is pressured by sediments above it. And in a marine environment, these kind of what you can call detritus are essentially pressured down so much that they turn into something called shale. And these shale particles are stored in porous sedimentary rock, and in both cases then become natural gases, oil, or just about any other fossil fuel, right? So one other reservoir we're going to have is just fossil fuels, and that's what I'm going to call it here. So we go here, and we're going to call that fossil fuels, and I'm going to say that this occurs by partial decomposition. It's essentially there, but it's not fully decomposed, and so we get peat, and this peat eventually becomes fossil fuels. One other thing that can happen by something called methanogenic archaeans is that, well, methane can be released, and these archaeans essentially work the same way. They take dead organic material, they process it, and then one of their byproducts is methane. Methane isn't directly carbon dioxide, but we'll get to why I added it in a second. So I'm going to say methane. And I will also put down here by methanogenic archaeans. I'm not going to write the whole thing. It's a bit of a blur. But this methane is aside from just being a pretty potent greenhouse gas, also capable of oxidizing in our atmosphere. And when this happens, when methane oxidizes, it forms more carbon dioxide. So it's now cyclically moving back into our initial reservoir, which is the atmosphere slash H2O reservoir. So I'm going to call this oxidation. So what are we left with now? Pretty much we have a pretty complex chain here. I'm just thinking if we have anything else. Well, another thing I'm forgetting here is maybe oil and gas. I mean, we do use oil and gas. However, when we use it, we also expel a lot of carbon dioxide, and this is by combustion. So in combustion, you essentially have hydrocarbon chains, and you essentially oxidize them or burn them, and in turn, you create H2O carbon dioxide, but also a lot of energy. But that in turn is a pretty inefficient process because you also create a lot of carbon dioxide, which again is released back into the environment. Another thing that, and I think this might be stretching it, but I think is also worth putting down, is that if we take dead organic material in marine environments, like let's just take an ocean, and we take maybe dead mollusks, we also need to ask ourselves what happens to their shell. And also, you know, where is all that stuff going? Because we know that in a lot of places in marine ecosystems, first of all, there isn't a lot of saprotrophs because, anoxic conditions. So you really need to ask yourself, what happens to this organism? Well, we know that mollusks have shells, and these shells are made out of calcium carbonate. Over time, this calcium carbonate, just like how peat turns into fossil fuels, is pressed against several layers of sedimentary rock and eventually is assimilated into limestone. So I'm going to put limestone here. Limestone is made up of calcium carbonate, which I'll in brackets mention right here. And so calcium carbonate isn't in itself carbon dioxide, but remember what we were talking about with bicarbonate ions in marine environments. We know that bicarbonate ions are formed in conjunction with hydrogen ions, and these hydrogen ions are acidic. So when we take an acid, react it with calcium carbonate, we get more dissolved carbon dioxide. And so that loops back into our main reservoir. And so we get acidification as our last carbon flux, or carbon dioxide flux. So I hope that was helpful. Thank you for listening.